All right, gentlemen, we'll continue this morning with analyzing for our last 3 times together. We are analyzing Ephesians 1, 15 through 23. Please take out, once again, your grammar summary sheets of Wallace, pages 726 through to the end. Please open up your Bibles, both English and Greek, and please open up any items that you would need, including the commentary, and let's continue analyzing, taking everything apart, doing not only the worm's eye view of looking at the details, but always keeping in mind the big picture, the bird's eye view, so that we can derive meaning from this, not the meaning we want, but the meaning that the writer intended, that God intended, so that we preach forth accurately God's word. We were in still verse 15. We were looking at the bracketed tain, kath, humas, piston, and we had talked about the fact that the article is separated from piston, and that article then substantivizes the prepositional phrase kath, humas. We talked about the fact that kath there is from kata, and the alpha has dropped of kata, and then because of the rough breathing of humas, the tau has been changed to the aspirated form of theta. Then we looked at the fact of faith in the Lord, and we said, of course, that the prepositional phrases have 2 forces. One is adjectival, the other is adverbial, and we concluded that faith in the Lord Jesus was adjectival. We said that Jesus here was a proper name and that many of the proper names in Greek are not declined. So Jesus there is not genitive, it's in simple apposition to the Lord Jesus. Jesus in simple apposition here. We then looked at the kai and noticed that tain agapein is a double direct object of the participle akusas. And of course, we looked also, just to go back for a second, at the participle and said it was anarthrous, was always articular, things that we had remembered from last semester. We translated it neutrally, and then we looked at it temporally, and we came to the conclusion it was probably causal. Because I heard of your faith and love. And now we come to tain, right after agapein. Who could tell me how the tain in verse 15, right after tain agapein, is functioning? Anybody? Second attributive, the love, the unto all the saints kind of love. It is second attributive position where the whole phrase up to the end of verse 15 has been turned into an adjective, and it is in the second attributive position, article, noun, article, adjective. The love here is modified by the fact that they have love for all the saints. This is what Jesus said would mark his disciples. By this shall all men know you're my disciples, by the love you have for one another. How is the established church doing here? Your subjective evaluation. How are we doing? So everybody sees that bracketed clause. It's not just love, it's the love for all the saints kind of love is what that second attributive position means. One thing in your pastoring that you will find very difficult, it is going to be difficult for you to love all the members of your congregation. You must. You must lead in love. Gentlemen, you are the under-shepherd. You must lead in love. Many of you will try to lead in doctrine. I think you've learned from 1 John that while doctrine is important, love is equally, if not more important, according to John. Don't you remember John? Some of you who are gladiators? Love is the pivot. If you love God, you'll keep His commandments. If you love one another, you'll take care of one another. You must love them all. Some are difficult to love. That's why it has to be a work of the new covenant and God's Spirit. Love for all the saints. Let's go on to verse 16. What is oo? Who knows what the word oo is? Negative what? Negative what? Begins with a P. Negative particle. Now let's talk about negative particles because this is a good review. It's why I constantly review, because I know that you all have memory problems because you have other classes. There is no class but Greek, and Farnell is its prophet. You should remember that. Oo is used with what mood? Is used with the indicative mood. There are some exceptions, but that's generally true. May is used with what? Non-indicative moods. Oo is outright denial. They asked John the Baptist in John, "Are you the Messiah?" And he went, "Oo, no." They asked him, "Are you the prophet?" John went, "No." It's used in the indicative mood for direct, outright denial. May is the more hesitant negative, used in the non-indicative, the potential moods. But when these two are combined, what do they call that when they're combined? Ume, what's this called? Well, that was enthusiastic of you. What's it called? Emphatic negation. Jesus said, "My sheep hear my voice, they follow me, and they shall not perish." He uses emphatic negation. In English, remember, when someone says no, two no's in English, if I say I do not have no bananas, even though that's bad English, that means you have some bananas. If I do not have no bananas, that means I have some bananas. So in English, it's somewhat like math. What's a negative times a negative? For you guys who are math guys. Remember that? It's a positive. In Greek, adding negatives make it doubly emphatically no. So let's go on. Paomai, who will parse that for us? I do not cease. Paomai, who's got it? Nathan, help me out here. I'm dying on the DVD because all of my, I don't know, man. I got to get my parsing system out. Paomai. It could be a deponent here, paomai. It's present, you said. Could somebody tell me about the present? What kind of aspect, what kind of action is the present indicating, and how do you determine it? Does anybody know how to divide up the columns? You come to a present indicative. Thanks, Tronway. I can tell the way the pain came across your face that you were attempting to recall it in the recesses of your mind. In the indicative mood, time is a factor. And it does impact aspect. In the non-indicative moods, no. So you have to do this for the indicative, but not the other ones. And so, are all presents habitual linear durative? So we have progressives, linears, some word like this, habituals, and then we have heuristic, where you don't play up. And we divided it up. 1, 2, 3, 4. Can anybody remember? You come to a present, you categorize it, and that helps you determine whether you should play up the action or not. Can anybody remember what they are? First, we had the progressive, iterative, customary, tendential. What were the aoristic? Because of their verb root, can you remember some of the aoristic verbs? Amy, Fami, Yaomai, Lego am I ego? What? Not Lego. Then we had nomic, futuristic. What? Historical. Remember that? Now you do. I don't know if the word historical, is it historical? Isn't that funny? That sounds, even to me at this point, a little bit, but. Yeah, I'll go over it. What?
Page 38.
Historical present, that's right. Had to put that into my head again. You ever have a word that all of a sudden, though you're so familiar with it, and all of a sudden it looks strange to you once again, just for a brief second. I don't know why that happens. Something in the deep recesses of my processing unit does that to me. So how would you treat this present? I do not cease, and argue for it in context. Can you play up the present here, or should you not?
Well, it seems like he's saying, right now I'm continuing not to cease. At the present time, I'm thanking God for you right now. Continue.
Since it's on the subject of prayer, and that would indicate that his intercessory prayer is repeated over periods of time. I do not cease. How is Eucharistone functioning? I do not cease. How is Eucharistone functioning? I do not cease Eucharistone. What is Eucharistone? Huh? Parse it, please. How is the participle functioning? It's an arthrous, so how is it functioning? It is epexegetical, completing the idea of what he doesn't cease. Paomai is, I do not cease to what? And Eucharistone here is completing the idea of what he doesn't cease. I do not cease thanking. Are you waiting for me to say Tronway? I'm looking right at you. I have direct eye contact. I know you're Tronway, and then when we locked, you just stood there still looking at me, and yet I clearly knew you had a question.
I wasn't sure if you were...
Be bold!
Why, is there any significance with using Eucharistone as a participle rather than as an infinitive?
Well, let's talk about that. That's a good question. Reason it through.
Participle might have more of a, it would be able to convey aspect.
So would an infinitive. See if the commentary says anything. Does it say, well, he uses the participle instead of the infinitive for this reason? Actually, Tronway, that's a good question. That's how you've got to analyze things grammatically. Most of the time, we've had an epexegetical complementary infinitive. This is an epexegetical complementary participle, and they do function that way. What's he say?
Is the verb with the negative particle palomai, I never cease, is a present middle that is always followed by a complementary nominative participle.
There you go. Paomai is stylistic. It takes, what does he say, always?
Always followed by a complementary nominative participle.
So paomai takes as its stylistic accompaniment, when it needs something to complete, it takes a participle. So you really couldn't say too much significance of it because it's stylistic there. But good, very good observation, Tronway. You're starting to think like a grammarian now. Why is that particular form there? Good question. How would you see the aspect of that participle? I do not cease what? Always thanking. You could play up the aspect here. So, what's next? Huper. Tell me about huper. Signaling what? Making humon what? Now, huper would indicate what by its on your behalf? Huper would be indicating what by its dictionary lexical meaning, its lexical semantic meaning. On your behalf. What's that sound like? Intercessory prayer. Two big prepositions for intercession, substitution. Well, at least substitution is huper, and especially then also anti. Paul is indicating that one of the main resources a pastor has in behalf of his people is what? Intercessory prayer. Sometimes people in church you will pray for, not merely because they're in your church, but because they can cause a lot of difficulty unless you pray for them. Guys in small churches, let me tell you something, guys in small churches, many of you might go out and have 100 people in your church. By the way, don't feel bad about that. In America, the average church is between 65 to 100 people. That is the average size. When you see mega churches, those are very much a rare thing, but they get most of the press. And let me tell you something about little churches and people. People will come in, and in a little church of 100, 120, people coming in to churches can make either a very positive or a very negative impact. It's like a little pond with big fish, And when someone comes in a little pond and throws their weight around like a big fish, they can do a lot of difficulty. Do not immediately, in desperation, let people come into your church if you have a small church without vetting them carefully, because in a small church, big fish in a small pond. In a big church, someone comes in and there's so many fish and the pond is so big that they don't make the impact that they would in a little church. Yes?
I was going to ask you what your membership process is at your church.
We make sure that they have a heartbeat and a checking account. No, I'm just kidding. We present our doctrinal statement. They're interviewed by the elders. They give their profession of faith. We get to know them. I urge people never to join my church until you've gotten to know us fully. But that's basically how we do it.
What are some avenues where they can get to know you better?
Attend the church for a long period of time, get to know the people. Again, in a big church, someone who becomes a member will not have usually the impact that someone who comes in off the street and wants to join your church. Be very careful of people who immediately upon coming into your church, especially if you're small, want to join within the next Sunday or two. There's a rule for me in my church that if someone comes in and is so enthusiastic immediately, it means that most likely I feel that they may give me trouble in the future because they ride a manic high and then they'll get into a manic low. I actually discourage people from joining the church until I get to know them. Again, my church is approximately 100 to 120 on a good Sunday. It's hard to be a pastor of a mega church and be a seminary professor too, but we do. And our church, we have a lot of people that will visit, but I don't want them joining immediately. Again, in a big church, you can have a lot of people come in and they don't make the impact. But if you have a smaller church, gentlemen, be very careful here. And if they come in overly enthusiastic, and I have another rule since we're off the subject of Greek. You guys always want to get off the subject of Greek. This is another rule that is very true. And while there may be an exception, this rule of thumb is true. People who come in disgruntled from another church usually will end up being disgruntled with you. There are people, religious people, who seem to have a predilection toward becoming unhappy in whatever church they're attending, and they hop from church to church. And when they come to your church and they start to rag, to complain about the previous church, take this principle and treat it as gold. If they were disgruntled with the previous church, they will probably become disgruntled with your church. It's the nature of humans, especially some. So if they come in and they start ragging on their previous church, here's the thought in my mind. I'm next. Now let me go up one more. Let me raise that bar or raise it, lower, whatever. Here's one that you must never forget. Preacher, if you have people coming into your church that rag on the last pastor, and I don't care what he did, you're next. Did you just hear what I said? In your church, if you have people come in and they rag on the previous pastor, not only the church, but the previous pastor. And they say things, and you go, wow, that's terrible that he did that. Wow. And you take their side. You will quickly need to learn that there are two sides to each story. And you know what's interesting? I would tell you that if these people want to join your church who are complaining about the previous pastor, you ought to call on the quiet the previous church and ask. Because I've found that when they come in, I had a church. It was in Northridge. I call it my hellish experience. I really do. So does my wife. And when I got there, there were these two deacons who controlled the church, who put in all the money. You know, it's funny. They always interview the pastor, but who is putting these kind of people in charge of the church? And here was what they accused the previous pastor of. So I've switched the illustration to something else, but it also applies. They called the last pastor, they said he was a liar and a deceiver. And they constantly ragged on him. And that's what taught me a lesson. Because 2 years later, after they didn't like my preaching, they said that I was some lordship preacher, which I'm not. I was just preaching through 1 John. We know we have been born again when we keep his commandments. That's not a lordship preacher. That's just being honest with the text. Guess what they called me? You are a liar and a deceiver. Here's another rule. When you go to a church and they start talking about the last pastor, I don't care what he did. You're next. The way they've treated their last pastor is the way they're going to treat you. So when you come in and you're in a little church, you're going to be desperate for numbers, whether you want to admit it or not. They come in and they rag on the previous church and rag on the previous pastor. Know this. After they become familiar with you, dollars to donuts, odds on are they're going to rag on you. Do not agree with them when they complain about the pastor and they tell you how wicked the pastor was. Don't sit there and go, wow, that's terrible. Don't say anything. The finest word that I can give you is what a physician taught me. My wife worked for a physician, and when he would be told things, and believe me, as a physician, he was told some great things by patients. You know what he would say? Interesting. Which is a totally empty word. You're not agreeing, you're not disagreeing. He'd just say this, Harvard-educated physician. Interesting. And now that's what I caught on. And I now know why he was saying it. And so now when people tell me stories about the pastor or what happened, what they did to them at the previous church, you know what I say? Interesting.
To a certain extent, though, aren't you? You're always going to have critics. You're always going to have people.
Yes, but even Proverbs says you do not invite fire into your bosom. Okay? Get to know people before they join your church. Now, this is a little off the Greek today. But you guys are precious. Anybody that wants to be in ministry, I believe, are precious. And knowing, first of all, I still am, but I was in my younger days very stupid. And I hang my head in shame for my stupidity. I mean, really stupid. Some guys will brag to you how wonderful. Let me brag to you about let me glory in my weaknesses, as Paul said. And I learned some things. People would come in. I was so anxious for people. They'd be ragging on the previous church and the pastor. Then I learned, guess what happened to me after 6 months? It's a pattern in a personality to do these things. Watch them carefully. Jordan, when I am done with ministry, the reason why I'm waiting till I'm done with my direct ministry is that I have this big of a file of unsigned letters. I have a file with a lady that I have a letter that was written to MacArthur when I was at that hellish experience. It was a lady that wrote a letter. I was just here as a new professor, and he didn't know me well. I don't think he knows me well now, but, she sent a letter to the president of the seminary about me. First, she was a preacher's kid. If you want all the little things about things, remember these things, because I had to learn them the hard way. Try to learn without my stupidity and stubbornness of learning things the hard way. I have found that preachers' kids can be some of the worst critics in the world to another preacher. That has happened to me many times, where preachers' kids, I honestly believe it's the Stockholm Syndrome. The preacher's kid has seen their mother or father criticized in ministry. So they identify with their persecutors and they become the acute criticizers of others in ministry. She was a preacher's daughter. She had a brother who was in ministry. She was herself married to a man in a second marriage that wouldn't even let her come to a church. She had to sneak out. She wrote a letter and said 2 things. Number 1, dear Dr. MacArthur, your professor that you have there is a liar and a deceiver. Now, what did I deceive them about? Well, they said that when I got there, I told them that I wasn't a lordship salvation preacher. I'm not. I just was preaching through 1 John, and you all have been through 1 John. How do you get away from the fact it said we know we've been born again when we keep his commandments? Come on. That's not lordship. That's just biblical. So I guess they wanted him to fire me because I preached like he did, try to be biblical. Next. Second thing in this letter, and I have it, is she said, your professor is in league with homosexuals. First of all, God died for them. We need to be loving and compassionate. But here was her logic. When her and those 2 deacons and others left my church because they didn't like my preaching, a cell phone building company, it wasn't a cell company, but someone who built private cell phone towers, saw me in the parking lot, said, we'll give you $1,000 a month if you'll let us put a cell tower. We'll make it look like a cross. No one will ever know. So the rumor got spread among these people that it was AT&T when it wasn't. It was just a private. This is when cell phones were just going up all over the place. So she wrote MacArthur and told him that I was in league. It wasn't even AT&T, but because it was a cell phone tower, because AT&T built cell phone towers, that I was in league with them. And this is what kills me most about that letter. And this was a preacher's kid. Here's how she signed it. You ready? Here's how she signed it after a devastating letter asking for them to chop my head off. Here's how she signed it. In Christian love. I have that letter and I'm going to write that book, but it has to be after I've gone out from ministry because some of the things I would probably say will get me in trouble all over the place. I'm always in trouble. I'm always in trouble. Some of the things I will say will disturb a lot of people. So I'll have to wait. I have unsigned letters from the church I'm at now saying, here's another one that they said I was going to take and sell the church and deposit the money in a private bank account. Now, my church knows one thing. I'm a blithering idiot when it comes to knowing how to do the books. I have a guy that's very good. I wouldn't even know. I don't even write my checks down. I don't know how. I mean, I'm the worst accountant in the world. How would I even be able to hide funds? I don't know. I have a stack this big. Here Paul says he can thank God for them. The hardest thing you're going to find sometimes as a preacher is trying to find things that you can thank God for. But please remember these things, guys. No one told me some of this stuff when I was in ministry. When I was first starting out, I learned these things the hard way. Try to remember them. Let's go on. I do not cease giving thanks in behalf of you. Meneon. What's meneon? How is it functioning? What's meneon? How is it functioning? Well, that was an enthusiastic response. Direct object, accusative direct object. Making memory of you. Poiumenos. Gentlemen, parse it for me, please. So with participles and infinitives, you can play up the aspect. You don't have to worry about it like you would with the indicative. Always having a memory of you. And I want to tell you something. Each church you pastor, you will have a memory of. I do. Many of you guys, I hope it's like in the old days, you'll go into a church and you'll be there for many years. It used to be in the colonies that when a pastor came to a church, the church took their care on for a lifetime. Did you know that? Many church would, in the colonies, would take on a pastor for a whole lifetime. He became their pastor, their shepherd, for 40, 50 years. Well, times have changed. One denomination, one Baptist denomination, when I was at seminary, 18 months was the average stay of a pastor in that Baptist denomination. That same denomination today is down to 8 months. Why? Well, the preacher comes in that Baptist denomination and decides that that church is a stepping stone for him for somewhere else. And so he begins immediately to position himself to leave for a bigger church or a better church. Or he comes in and gets chewed up. You all know that there's a honeymoon in a church. Do you not know that? Do you not know that when some church hires you, there's going to be a honeymoon? Where, just like in dating, when you date, don't you put your best foot forward, trying to impress whomever you're dating? Yes, no? Churches will do that. So will you. About 9 months later, 8 months later, now these are just averages, sometimes it can end in 3 months. The honeymoon's over. And usually young men in their first conflict do something that you shouldn't do. That's it. They take their toys and they go home someplace. That's it. You're giving me a hard time. I'm leaving. Don't do that. It's easy to do when you're young. I did it. Try to get over that first hurdle. Now, here's the thing you want to know. Gentlemen, you look at any church, see how long they kept their last pastor. And ask them, why did your last pastor leave? And what do you think of that last pastor? Well, our last pastor was only here a year. Well, he wasn't very tolerant of some of our views. Guess what? That may be an indication of how you will be treated. I used to have a professor who would always say in class, discouraging me terribly. I was a reluctant preacher. I grew up in the church, saw what happened with preachers, and he would always say, if you can stay out of ministry, do so. If God hasn't called you in a subjective feeling of this is what I must do, don't go into it. And I'd get so discouraged. And then I had my ministry experiences and realized I now know what he meant. The only thing that's going to keep you in churches, gentlemen, when you have difficulties in church is going to be the sense of God's called you to ministry. Some of you guys have tent-making abilities, don't you? What is a tent-making ability? Many guys in ministry now are coming into ministry as a second career. The average span of ministry is now 20 years for a guy. It wears people out. So some young guys come in, stay for 20 years, they're burnt out and leave. Or some guys in a different profession decide mid-profession to go into ministry and they last for 20 years. That's the way it's been going. Because there's tremendous burnout. And if you have a tent-making profession, here is going to be your temptation. That you get a difficulty at a church, well, I'll just go back to being a physician. I know we get physicians here. I'll go back to being a lawyer. We get lawyers here. I'll go back to being an engineer. We get engineers here. Oh, if I had a tent-making ability. How many times I would have run just like Jonah. Would it be right to run? I don't know, but I think back and I see you precious guys, and some of you will have a tent. How many of you here have a prior, we get young, very young guys here, but many seminaries, it's a second career for them. The doc was a physician. You worked for a big company. And what was your thing that you did for them?
I was in charge of our worldwide accounts division.
Were you the guy that ended up on that island?
Yeah.
And lost his volleyball?
No, but they kicked me out.
You know, and you spent 5 years on that island? Or was that, it was in a movie, it had to be real. Yeah, that was Tom Hanks, that's right, okay. What were we talking about?
Second careers.
And I'm telling you something, ministry is not easy. And some guys, when they get into that difficulty, will jump back to their career. Yes?
Does that sometimes happen in academia where you see maybe someone's pastoring and teaching or pastoring, but then they want nothing to do with the ministry, but they know so much about it, that they have a skill set, then they go into just kind of academia, but they're kind of burnt out? Or is that not really happen? Because that seems like it would be a good second avenue maybe.
Well, I see it more with guys that maybe they had a degree in something, then went into ministry, and then they had a difficulty at church and decided to go back painting houses.
they've tuned out from the actual ministry. They just
Well-
want to talk about it.
The problem is that many who are in academia have not had much pastoral experience. It is very difficult to keep your feet in both worlds. I have, for a variety of reasons. And that's why when I see you precious guys have such difficulty in churches, I understand what happens. I understand that I've been a punching bag, and some of it's been me who's been at fault. You're young, you're filled with testosterone, you're filled with idealism, and you're filled with the theory of what they told you in a seminary, and you go in there and then you realize that shepherding sheep is a skill that is learned over time. You learn to be patient, you learn to be more gentle, you learn things. And sometimes the academic guys haven't had enough. You ever see a rock in a river? Well, that rock wasn't a beautifully smooth stone when it started out. It was jagged, but the river smoothed that rock out. I love river stones because they're nice and smooth. They weren't like that before. The rough current beat it up. And that's why I'm sort of thankful, because I know I try to keep one foot in academia, the other foot in the church, so that I can tell you these things and show you my stupidity of some of the things that I did. A lot of times, though, it's difficult for academics to do that. They want to write, or I try to do both. But in a seminary, it's very good to have guys that have been in that river and had to take all the rough edges knocked off of them. And I'm one of those that still have plenty of rough edges, but I understand. That gentleman that kept telling me, and others, if you can stay out of ministry, do it. I couldn't understand that at first. Because I thought, well, I'm reluctant to begin with. Now he's telling me stay out of it. And I felt conflicted. But he told a story about when he got one of his first churches. He literally rolled up in the U-Haul van with his stuff to start ministry at the church in front door of his house. The house was empty. All it had was a phone in it. Just had moved across country to start this church, rolls up and hears the phone ringing in the empty house that he had rented. And it was a woman who said, "Is this the pastor?" He said, "Yes, it is." He says, "You need to get right over here to my house and visit me." He says, "Well, let me just get the movers putting things in, and I'll be right over." And she just laced him in lavender because he wouldn't immediately drop everything and come over. Listen to me, gentlemen. I know you'll think that's funny, but you're going to have a lot of people like that. That's why you have to be called, guys. I don't know what that is. I don't think I can quantify it. You just have to have this heart tug. I've actually said to my mother, you must have, at times when it's been difficult in ministry, are you sure you guys just didn't convince me to do this when I learned in my ancestry, they just came out with the 1940 census. Did you know that? And I decided one day just to get into it and see what I could learn about my dad's side of the family, and found out that one of my dad's cousins was in World War II, was killed, but he was going to be a preacher. And I just wonder, Lord, are you sure? Because I am more Jeremiah than, Isaiah is God called Isaiah to walk naked and barefoot or something like that passage. Or is it Ezekiel? I set my face like flint. I'm Jeremiah. I'm the weeping prophet. I go home and I feel terrible. I'm not a brave guy. I'm not one of those tough guys. I'm one of those Jeremiah guys that I'm like Barney Fife with looking for the bullet that Andy gave him. And it can be discouraging. And so you guys got to hang in there. And you've got to feel that call. If somebody told you you'd make a great preacher, but you don't feel the call, don't go into it. Because the only thing that has kept me in ministry after some of these experiences, and I can't imagine people that have huge churches, the hurt they must have. If I've had the hurt in my size churches of 120, fluctuating, how much have these guys with these big churches, the hurt that they must face? So you got to hang in there and feel called. I mean, look at Paul. Look at all the grief Paul got over those churches. And he still loved them and still prayed for them. You can't pray imprecatory psalms. You're going to feel like you'd like to. But he found something good in every one of those churches that he could thank the Lord for and kept praying for them. The church would be wonderful if it wasn't for people. And I read this thing when you're candidating for churches that I laughed and I learned to use it because I liked it and it was good. Here's what you do. You go to be interviewed for a church. They're going to think you're nuts, but you have to be in ministry a little bit. Here's what you do. Say if your church was a woman to your interviewing board, describe how she would dress, what she would act like, would she wear makeup, what kind of dress would she like, what would be her hobbies and habits, and then from there, you get a very interesting reply. And they'll look at you, what do you mean? Well, if your church isn't the church a woman? Isn't it the bride of Christ? So it isn't so far away as you think, right? And then listen to their description, the elders or the interviewing pulpit committee, about what they think their church would be like if she's well, ask them, would she go to a movie? Oh, no. That'll tell you something about the congregation you're dealing with. What kind of food does she like? These kind of things. What's her hobbies? You get a lot of information from questions like that but you've got to be called, gentlemen. Because listen to me. Pastoring a church is like marriage. Once you go there as the under shepherd, you're married to those people in a sense. And when preachers end up shipwrecked, it's like a divorce. Because you'll have invested your life in those people, and then some of them will end up causing you to leave, and it is a very difficult thing. Let's go back to Greek, but these are the things before we leave you. You know, Greek is great, but theology and pastoring have many practical sides. Making mention of you in my prayers. What would you do when you came across prosukon? What would you do? What would you do immediately? What should you do immediately when you see the word prosukon? Well, I would think, what kind of words does Paul use for prayer, and what's the particular shade of this term for prayer? Wouldn't you? Do you ever look at words and ask why that word is there and not another word for prayer, or something same way, why is that word not another word? How would you see the moo there? In my prayers. How would you see the moo? Careful how you answer that. Someone say, I believe, Maximus, it's possessive. But what would the rule be that since prosukon has a corresponding verbal noun, or verb, it would probably be subjective genitive. "17. What would the hina indicate in verse 17? Making mention to you of my prayers in order that. Purpose of his prayer is in 17. The purpose of Paul's prayer. What does he want God to do? What does he want them to do? Give me a big picture of verse 17. What's the big picture? What is he praying for God to do for his people? For what? For Christ-likeness, so that they can truly understand the great privilege that they have been given. That they can really grasp the wonderful nature of salvation. And they can become more like Jesus. Because that's what you're doing, gentlemen. Why are you in a church? Because it's a good living? Forget that. You're there to help people that belong to the Lord. They're a flock that God says, take part of my flock and teach them how to be like Jesus. That's what you're doing. You know, when it all comes down, hermeneutics, all of this, don't get lost with the big picture. What are you doing as a pastor? God has said, I'm going to give you some sheep from my flock. Now teach them to be like Jesus. Show them how. You can't just show them by intellectually showing them. You've got to role model Jesus yourself. You're the under shepherd. You have to role model Jesus to them. You, gentlemen, will set the pace. If you want a critical church, you be a critical preacher, pastor, always ragging on people. You want a loving church? You be loving and gentle. But that doesn't mean that you're completely without any evaluation on things, but you're loving and gentle, you're patient. Your people sin, you're patient with them. Your people have doctrinal problems, you're patient with them. Gentlemen, gentlemen, gentlemen. One of the great mistakes of young preacher boys, take it from someone who knows, is that you're not patient with people. See these precious people as sheep who need a gentle shepherd to take care of them, to make them like Jesus. This is what a pastor's heart is. And if you don't have a pastor's heart, a love for people, a love for your sheep, stay out of ministry. More damage has been done by preacher boys who do not have a pastor's heart, a genuine love for shepherding people. And let me conclude with this for today, because we're completely off Greek. These are the last few things before we wrap it up this semester. Listen to me now. In academia, they measure intellectual intelligence. Math, spatial, verbal. What we don't measure and what we need to increase our skill on is social intelligence. There are so many preacher boys who are intellectually intelligent and have no social skill. I'm not saying I'm perfect. I'm still have a lot to learn. But I've learned something, that a lot of a preacher's problems, some of which were mine, were a lack of social skill with people, dealing with people. You remember that How to Win Friends and Influence People by Andrew Carnegie? Say for what you want, but you ought to read that as a preacher. Why, you heretic, that positive thinking. No, you ought to read it. because he identified social skill that many preachers lack. We get guys that are very intellectual go into preaching and they want to hide in their office, study for 50 hours the Greek text, carpet bomb on Sunday, and then go back to studying again. That's not social intelligence, gentlemen. You've got to learn people skill. My wife worked for that doctor. You know what? He was the most great disease finder in the world. That guy was a good disease hunter. But he absolutely was bankrupt when it came to social interaction with his patients. Lady came in and said, "My feet are hurting." He says, "Well, that's because you're trying to shove your big foot into that small shoe." I mean, it was worse than that. Preacher boys, for every 1 hour you spend studying Greek, 4 hours improving your social skill with people. Fundamentalists particularly need social skill. I know I've stopped preaching and gone to meddling, as the old preacher said, but you need social skill, social intelligence, getting along. Somebody comes at you like they do me all the time, and I fail sometimes. And I got a lot of work to do. But let me end with this today. Social intelligence is key.